It started with a dare, the kind that makes your stomach tighten even before you agree to it. Late one autumn evening, four of us, my cousin Aaron, my friend Mia, my younger brother Tyler, and me, stood at the edge of an overgrown lot at the far end of town. Looming before us was the Holloway House, an abandoned two-story structure that had been empty for decades. Its windows were boarded, the roof sagged like a broken spine, and the front porch tilted to one side as though it were trying to shake off visitors. Nobody lived there, not since the Holloway family vanished one night in 1987, leaving behind half-eaten dinners and a dog tied in the backyard that had starved. People said the place had been cursed ever since, but that was the kind of story kids repeated without really believing. Still, I felt uneasy as I stared at it. The house wasn't just empty. It seemed watchful, like it had a memory of who'd walked inside and who never came back out. The air around it smelled faintly of mildew and copper, damp but metallic, almost like blood. The lot was surrounded by tall grass and twisted trees, their branches black silhouettes against a dull gray sky. The house seemed to breathe with the shifting wind, creaks and groans echoing from within, though no one had stepped inside yet. I glanced at Aaron, who smirked and shoved me forward. "You first," he said. Inside, the air was colder, almost unnaturally so, as if the house had trapped decades of winter in its walls. Our flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, landing on peeling wallpaper, broken picture frames, and furniture draped in moldy sheets. Dust floated like ash in the stillness, disturbed by every cautious step. Tyler whispered that he thought he saw something move near the staircase, but when we aimed our lights, there was nothing, just a railing split down the middle and shadows that clung too tightly to the corners. We laughed nervously, the sound bouncing hollow against the empty rooms, but it was the kind of laughter that cracked easily into silence that we moved deeper, passing through what must have been the dining room. A long wooden table, warped and buckled, still held a rusted candelabra. Plates and silverware were scattered across the floor, as if someone had dropped them mid-meal. One plate still had a hardened crust of food on it, decades old, but disturbingly intact. Mia bent closer, shining her light, and swore she saw a fresh bite taken out of it, as if someone had just eaten there. Aaron barked a laugh, claiming it was just rot, but none of us wanted to look too long. Something about the house felt frozen in time, not decayed the way it should have been after 35 years. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Each one pressed into the silence until it filled the room. We all froze, eyes darting upward toward the ceiling. Aaron's bravado slipped for a second, though he forced a grin and whispered, "Probably just raccoons." But we knew better. These weren't scurrying, scratching noises. These were human steps. They paused directly above us, in the very center of the ceiling, like whoever, or whatever, was up there knew exactly where we stood. The air felt like it collapsed in on itself, the silence after each step louder than the creaks themselves. Tyler's hand gripped mine so tightly his nails dug into my skin. And for the first time, I wished we had never come here. Margaret was waiting when I arrived. She stood by her car, arms folded tightly as though the cold clung to her more than it should. Up close, she looked older than her voice had suggested. Creased skin, tired eyes, the kind of woman who had seen too many late nights with paperwork. She greeted me politely but without warmth, her eyes flicking up at the house in quick, nervous glances. When she handed me a thick envelope of documents, I noticed her hands tremble. "I won't be staying long," she admitted, forcing a smile. "This place, it has a way of making people uncomfortable." Before I could ask what she meant, she pressed an old brass key into my palm and gestured toward the door. The front steps groaned under my weight. The wooden boards were warped and soft, and I found myself stepping carefully to avoid falling through. The keyhole was stiff, as if it hadn't been used in years, but with a twist and a push, the heavy door creaked open. A musty breath of air rolled out, thick with the smell of rot, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I stepped inside, the floorboards moaning beneath me, and sunlight from the open door revealed dust particles swirling in the stale air. The house wasn't just old. It felt abandoned, forgotten, and yet somehow watchful, like it had been waiting for me. The front hall stretched longer than I expected, lined with faded wallpaper patterned in sickly yellow roses. Family portraits hung unevenly, their glass frames cracked and cloudy. I paused at one, a stern-looking man in an old suit, his eyes dark and unkind. Something about his expression made me uncomfortable. I reached up, intending to straighten the frame, but before my fingers touched it, the portrait tilted slightly on its own, just a subtle shift, as if nudged by unseen hands. I froze, staring, my heartbeat quickening. Dust trickled down the wall beneath it. I tried to convince myself it was the wood settling, but the unease lingered. The rooms opened one by one, each colder than the last. The living room was a cavern of faded furniture, lace curtains that sagged like cobwebs, and a fireplace filled with ashes that looked fresh despite the obvious years of neglect. The kitchen smelled faintly of rotten food, though the counters were bare. A single plate sat in the sink, still streaked with something dried and brown. I found myself listening constantly. Every creak, every sigh of the house seemed amplified, echoing off the walls like whispers. At one point, I thought I heard the distinct sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, crossing the upstairs hall. I froze, listening, but the sound faded into silence eventually. I climbed the staircase, hand grazing the smooth banister polished by years of use. The upstairs hallway was narrower, darker, the air thick and stagnant. Doors lined the walls, most of them closed. I opened the first, a bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a mattress sunken in the middle like a grave. Another door led to a study cluttered with books whose pages had yellowed and curled. But it was the last door at the end of the hall that drew me. Unlike the others, it was locked, and when I pressed my ear to the wood, I swore I heard the faintest sound from inside, something soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. My hand tightened around the brass key Margaret had given me, but something deep in my gut urged me not to try it. Not yet. I didn't sleep in the house that first night. Something about the locked door unsettled me too much, so I drove back into the nearest town, Ashwick, a small place with one gas station, a diner, and a scattering of tired brick buildings. The town seemed oddly still, as though its heartbeat had slowed to match the hollow woods that surrounded it. I parked outside the diner, the kind of place with peeling paint on the sign and blinds that rattled against the windows when the wind passed. Inside, the warm smell of coffee and fried food offered a temporary reprieve from the lingering chill of Blackwood Hollow. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, greeted me with a practiced smile that faltered when I mentioned why I was in town. "Blackwood Hollow, huh?" she said, setting down a chipped mug of coffee. "Can't say I envy you." She leaned closer, lowering her voice so the handful of other patrons wouldn't overhear. "Folks around here don't like to talk about that place. People who stay too long, they change. They get sick in the head, or they vanish." Her words were matter of fact, not dramatic, as if she were reciting something she had long since accepted as truth. Later, at the counter while paying my bill, an older man in a battered work jacket struck up a conversation. He had overheard enough to know where I was headed. "Your uncle. He wasn't right," the man said, voice gravelly. Kept to himself most of the time, but when he did come into town, he'd talk about things that didn't make sense. Said the house listened. Said the rooms moved when no one was looking. The man paused, his eyes clouding as if recalling something unpleasant. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear it, out there in the woods. Like the house was breathing. I laughed it off in the moment, though the sound came out forced. But the locals weren't done. On my way back to the car, another resident, a younger man smoking by the gas station, called out, "Don't open the door upstairs." The word stopped me cold. He didn't elaborate, didn't even look at me again. Just took another drag of his cigarette, eyes fixed on the horizon like he'd already said too much. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his rigid posture made me back away instead. Driving back to the house, the woods seemed darker than before, though it was only late afternoon. The road narrowed, and every shadow seemed to lean closer to the car, as though eager to swallow it whole. The warnings replayed in my head. The house listened. Don't open the door upstairs. I tried to dismiss them as superstition, the kind of stories small towns pass around like heirlooms. But when I parked in the clearing again and looked up at the house, I felt a sharp drop in my stomach. The upstairs window, the same one where I thought I'd seen light before, now stood wide open, curtains fluttering faintly in the wind. I hadn't touched it. I decided I couldn't avoid it forever. The house was mine now, at least on paper, and I couldn't keep fleeing to the diner or some cheap motel every time it unsettled me. So that evening, I returned with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a thermos of coffee, determined to spend the night in one of the downstairs rooms. I picked the living room. It had the fireplace, and the idea of a central hearth felt safer, less suffocating than the upstairs hallway. Still, as I unrolled the sleeping bag across the dusty wooden floor, every part of me felt like I was settling into the jaws of something waiting to snap shut. The house was loud at night, louder than I'd expected. The walls popped and cracked. The floors shifted as though someone paced the halls, and the wind whistled through unseen cracks in the frame. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a chair scraping across the upstairs floor. I sat up, my heart thundering, flashlight beam trembling in my hands. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I told myself it was just the wood contracting in the cold, but the explanation didn't comfort me. When the silence settled again, it wasn't empty. It was tense, like the pause between breaths. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to the distinct feeling of being watched. The flashlight lay beside me, its beam dimmed to nothing, so I fumbled for the matches I had brought. The flare of light revealed something that made my skin crawl. The family portraits in the hall had shifted. Where before they hung scattered and uneven, now they all leaned inward at the same angle, tilted as though they were straining to look into the living room where I lay. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to look away, telling myself fatigue was twisting my perception. But when I turned back, I swore one of the frames was still moving, swaying gently before it stilled. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, straining to listen. That's when I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. Not mine, something heavier, slower, coming from directly above me. The locked room. My scalp prickled as I realized the sound wasn't faint anymore. It was steady, deliberate, and it seemed to sync with the rise and fall of the house itself, as though the structure was exhaling through its walls. The breathing went on for what felt like hours, until, suddenly, it stopped. The silence afterward was worse. It felt like whatever was upstairs had realized I was listening by dawn. I was stiff and exhausted, my nerves frayed raw. Pale light crept through the tattered curtains, illuminating the dust in the air like drifting ash. For a moment, I almost believed I had imagined it all. But when I rose to pack up my things, I noticed something that froze me in place. On the floorboards just beyond the living room, leading toward the staircase, were a series of faint footprints in the dust. Bare feet, large, heavy, and fresh. They hadn't been there the night before, and they stopped halfway up the stairs, right in front of the locked door. By the second morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The footprints, the breathing, the shifting portraits, everything seemed to point back to that one door at the end of the upstairs hall. The locals' warnings echoed in my head, but they only fueled my obsession. I had inherited the house, but it didn't feel like mine. Not while that door remained closed. That afternoon, after forcing down a breakfast I barely tasted, I stood at the foot of the staircase, staring upward with the brass key burning cold in my pocket. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but curiosity, like a hook in my gut, pulled me forward. The upstairs hall felt darker than usual, as though the house knew what I was about to do. Each step groaned louder than the last, and the faded yellow wallpaper seemed to close in around me. When I reached the door, I hesitated, listening. The breathing was gone. There was nothing, only a silence so deep it pressed against my ears. My hand shook as I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, it refused to turn, like the metal itself resisted. Then, with a reluctant click, the bolt shifted and the door creaked open an inch. A rush of air escaped, stale and cold, carrying with it a smell that made me gag. Damp wood, rot, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. I pushed the door wider, my flashlight beam cutting into the gloom. The room was small, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been squeezed by the walls around it. The wallpaper peeled in strips, exposing rotting boards beneath. In the center stood a single chair, its back facing me, and on the floor beside it, a dark stain that had seeped deep into the wood. My throat tightened. The stain was too large, too uneven to be anything but old blood. I moved closer, flashlight trembling, and noticed deep gouges scratched into the floor around the chair, long, desperate marks, as though someone had been dragged or chained there. The air grew colder the longer I stood inside. My breath fogged in front of me, and the smell of decay thickened. I circled the chair slowly, each step creaking loud in the tiny room. When I finally saw its front, my stomach lurched. The seat was empty, but the chair wasn't untouched. The arms were worn smooth, as though gripped countless times, and the backrest was scarred with dozens of carvings. Words, initials, dates, scratched in uneven, frantic lines. Some were too faded to read, others too chaotic to make sense of. But one phrase, repeated over and over again, stood out clearly. It breathed with us suddenly. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound was deafening in the small space, and my flashlight flickered violently. My chest tightened as the temperature dropped even further. Then I heard it again, that same slow, heavy breathing. But this time, it wasn't muffled through walls or floors. It was right there, in the room with me. My flashlight cut across the far corner, and for a split second, I thought I saw something shift, something tall, dark, and impossibly thin. Before I could focus, the light went out completely, plunging me into suffocating darkness. The second the light went out, the room changed. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs as though the very atmosphere was hostile. I reached for the door handle, my fingers slipping over cold metal slick with condensation. It wouldn't move. I twisted, pulled, shoved with my shoulder, but it held firm. Behind me, the sound of breathing filled the space, slow, steady, measured. It wasn't the sound of a body needing air. It was the sound of something enjoying it, savoring it. A scraping noise followed, deliberate and unhurried. The unmistakable drag of fingernails or claws across wood. It circled me, though I could see nothing. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out reason. Hello. The word slipped from me before I could stop it, small and pathetic. The breathing paused, the scrape stilled. Silence. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. Then a low, guttural chuckle erupted, so close it felt like it came from inside my own chest. I staggered back, pressing against the wall, teeth chattering though the cold was only part of it. The flashlight sputtered to life with a faint buzz, the beam weak and jittery. What it revealed made bile rise in my throat. The chair wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat slumped there, skeletal, impossibly thin, with skin that stretched like paper over jutting bones. Its chest heaved with exaggerated breaths, ribs flexing in and out as though they were bellows feeding some hidden fire. My light passed over its face, but the shadows clung to it, obscuring every feature except the gleam of teeth, grinning too wide, too eager. And on the back of the chair, the words I had seen carved before now seemed fresh, the grooves wet, as though written only seconds ago. It breathes with meth thing twitched violently, its head snapping toward me. The chuckle warped into something harsher, like a wheeze mixed with laughter. My body moved before my mind did, throwing myself against the door one more time. This time, it flew open with a force that nearly pitched me forward into the hall. I scrambled out, the flashlight beams swinging wildly, catching fragments of crooked portraits and peeling wallpaper. The breathing didn't stop. It spilled into the hallway, muffled but relentless, as though the walls themselves carried it now. The door slammed shut behind me, so hard the floor shook, dust sifting down like I tore down the staircase, my feet barely catching the steps, until I burst out into the clearing. The cold night air slapped my face, burning my lungs as I bent double, gasping. The house loomed against the sky, black and silent, its windows staring blankly down at me. I wanted to believe I had outrun it, that the thing was still locked away in its room. But as the wind cut through the clearing, I heard it again, soft, steady, mocking. The same chuckle, carried through the trees, following me into the open air. My stomach turned to ice. Whatever was in that room hadn't stayed behind. Didn't leave the property that day. Part of me wanted to drive until the trees thinned, until the house was nothing but a nightmare in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't. The room upstairs had left me shaken, but it had also left me with a burning need to understand. My uncle had lived here, alone, for years. He must have known what was in that room. Maybe he'd even written something about it. With daylight filtering through the broken shutters, I convinced myself the house was less dangerous in the sun. I was wrong, but the hunger for answers outweighed my fear. Paragraph 2, I started with the study. Dust clung to everything. The books on the shelves curled and brittle, many of them half-eaten by moisture. Yet, tucked among the crumbling spines, I found something unusual, a row of journals bound in worn leather, their edges darkened by age. Each one bore my uncle's initials, R.H. I carried them to the desk and flipped through the first. His handwriting was shaky, obsessive, each page filled with cramped lines that bled into one another. Most entries circled around the house itself. Words repeated again and again, breathing, feeding, listening. My hands trembled as I realized these weren't just ramblings. They were warnings. Paragraph 3 by the third journal, his tone shifted. He no longer wrote of the house like a thing he feared, but like a thing he was becoming part of. The hollow has chosen me. One passage read. The walls move when I ask. The air bends to my breath. It needs me, and I need it. My stomach knotted as I turned page after page of ritualistic scribbles. Drawings of the house's layout with strange symbols etched into the margins, records of nights when he claimed the rooms had shifted while he slept. One entry froze me cold. The upstairs door must remain locked. It is the heart. If it opens, the hollow breathes freely. Paragraph 4, a sharp sound made me jerk upright. The journals slipped from my lap, scattering across the floor. It came from the fireplace, an old iron grate black with soot. I crept closer, heart hammering. Inside, beneath a layer of ashes, something metallic glinted. I reached in, fingers brushing cold iron, and pulled out a small lockbox. Its surface was scorched, the latch rusted. I pried it open with trembling hands. Inside were scraps of paper, photographs, and a small cloth pouch. The photographs showed people I didn't recognize, gaunt, hollow-eyed, standing in front of the house at different times. None of them looked happy. In the pouch, I found something far worse. A bundle of yellowed fingernails tied together with twine. Paragraph 5, the last paper at the bottom of the box was a letter, folded so many times it nearly tore in my hands. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. If you are reading this, it means I failed. The hollow cannot be inherited. It consumes what it claims. Leave the house. Burn it, if you can. But do not breathe with it. My uncle's signature sprawled beneath. My mouth went dry as I read the words again. A gust of air swept through the room, scattering ashes across the floor, and for a split second, I swore I heard it again. That same slow, steady breathing. Coming not from upstairs this time, but from the very walls surrounding me. By the third day without sleep, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale and sunken. Every time I closed my lids, I saw the photos from my phone, the figure drawing nearer, frame by frame, until it felt like Adler's shadow was burned into my retinas. I wanted to leave, to run and never look back, but every attempt ended the same. My hand would reach for the doorknob, but then a weight pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, whispering in my ear, "Stay." Claire knocked that afternoon. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept either. "It's worse now, isn't it?" she whispered. I couldn't answer, but she stepped inside anyway, clutching a rosary in one hand. She told me she had seen Adler too, not with her eyes, but in dreams, standing in her doorway, waiting. "He doesn't want the apartment," she said, voice trembling. "He wants us." Before I could respond, her head snapped upward. Footsteps thundered across the ceiling, heavy, furious, shaking the light fixtures. Then silence. The silence didn't last. From the bedroom, the door slammed shut with such force the walls shuddered. Claire screamed, the rosary slipping from her fingers, beads scattering across the floor. My phone buzzed at the same moment, lighting up on the coffee table. Another motion alert. I almost didn't look, but some terrible part of me needed to. The photo showed my bedroom, the door wide open, Adler standing in the doorway. His shadowy form was sharper than ever before. Arms too long, head cocked, mouth stretching wide. The air thickened, pressing against my chest until I thought my ribs would crack. Then, slowly, the bedroom door creaked open in real time. My stomach dropped as Adler stepped through. Not a shadow this time, not a blur, but there. His form was darker than the room itself, every edge trembling as though reality struggled to contain him. his head tilted back, mouth splitting wider, a soundless scream tearing through the air like static. Claire collapsed to her knees, sobbing, whispering prayers that dissolved into choked gasps that I couldn't move. My body was locked, my vision tunneling until all I could see was him. Adler, or what was left of him, towered in the center of my living room, pacing in a slow, deliberate circle around the couch. The same circle I'd heard from the ceiling night after night. Each step shook the floor, dragging, deliberate, unending. Then he stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. His head snapped toward me, and in that instant, I knew. He wasn't pacing anymore. He was circling me. By the time I drove back to the hollow, the storm had broken. Sheets of rain lashed the windshield, wipers barely keeping pace. The trees lining the road bent and groaned as though something massive moved through them. More than once, I considered turning back, but it was as if the road behind me no longer existed. My eyes slid away from the rearview mirror, unable to focus. My knuckles whitened on the wheel as I rounded the last bend, and the house came into view. Even through the downpour, it looked sharper, taller, more alive than it had before, its windows burning faint with an amber glow. Inside, the air was heavier, almost unbreathable. Water dripped through the ceiling, soaking into warped floorboards, yet the walls themselves seemed untouched, pulsing faintly, as if with some internal rhythm. I tried to head for the study, to gather the journals and box, but the hallway stretched wrong. Where before it had been a straight path to the stairs, now it bent sideways, elongating into a corridor I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. The house wasn't just holding me. It was rearranging itself around me that I stumbled through rooms that didn't belong. A parlor filled with rotting furniture I'd never seen. A child's bedroom with a rusted crib and toys scattered across the floor, their eyes missing. The portraits on the walls had changed too. Where once they showed strangers, they now bore my face, slightly blurred, twisted in expressions of fear I hadn't made yet. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find the stairs, but the house spun me in circles, breathing louder with each step. Finally, I found myself back at the locked door, though I hadn't climbed the staircase to reach it. My throat tightened, dread flooding me. The door was ajar this time, leaking a thin line of darkness that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the storm outside. From within came that laugh again, low, guttural, crawling along the inside of my skull. My hand lifted without my permission, fingers brushing the wood, and the house seemed to exhale in approval. The walls shivered, dust raining down, and the floor beneath my feet thumped like a heartbeat. I staggered back, but the house wouldn't let me leave. The door behind me slammed shut, and the air grew thick, heavy with pressure. The walls groaned as though they were closing in, and every breath I took was answered by another, deeper one, closer, louder, drowning out the storm. My flashlight flickered, beams shaking across the hall. In that thin sliver of light, I saw the figure again, stretched taller than the doorway, ribs straining with each monstrous inhale. Its whisper slithered into my ear. Now, breathe with me. The hallway pulsed with that grotesque rhythm. Every breath the house drew rattling through my bones. My flashlight sputtered out completely, plunging me into thick, suffocating dark. Only the faint glow from the half-open door remained, pulsing like a living wound. My chest burned, each inhale harder than the last, as though the hollow was pulling the air straight from my lungs. I stumbled forward, not out of choice but compulsion, the house guiding me to its heart. Inside, the room had changed. No longer just dust and broken furniture. It had become something like a throat. Walls slick, pulsing, ribbed with wooden beams that resembled bones. The smell of rot and wet earth clung to everything. In the center stood my uncle, or what was left of him. His figure was emaciated, skin gray and stretched tight, but his eyes burned with feverish devotion. He opened his mouth, and the house breathed through him, his chest expanding far wider than any human should allow. "It chose me," he rasped, "and now it chooses you." The figure behind him rose higher, ribs cracking outward like branches breaking, face indistinct but hungry. My uncle stepped closer, reaching out a skeletal hand, his nails black and curling. I wanted to scream, to run, but the air locked in my throat. My chest convulsed, my lungs refusing to obey. It was trying to make me sink with it, to pull me into its endless inhale, to make me part of its rhythm. I thought of the letter, his last desperate warning. Do not breathe with it, summoning every shred of will. I did the only thing left. I stopped breathing. Pain ripped through me instantly, my body screaming for air, but I held on. My uncle's face twisted, his expression flickering between reverence and rage. The figure behind him shrieked, a sound like timber splitting, and the walls convulsed violently. Without my breath, the house faltered, its rhythm staggering. Plaster rained down, beams cracked, and the darkness shrank back like something wounded. My uncle lunged, mouth gaping, but collapsed into ash before he reached meth. Last thing I remember is collapsing in the rain outside, lungs burning as I finally gasped for air. Behind me, the hollow groaned like a dying animal, its windows bursting outward in a spray of glass. But when I turned back, the house still stood, silent, intact, watching. I don't know how long I lay there, soaked and shivering, before dawn broke. I left Ashwick that morning, journals still inside, the lockbox still buried in its walls. Yet even now, in quiet rooms and dark nights, I sometimes hear it, that steady, patient breathing, waiting for me to fall back in rhythm.